Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our read-through of Sacred and Terrible Air by Group Ibex, or rather, by Robert Kurvitz and translated by Group Ibex. We're going to jump back into it with Chapter 14. 14. List of Absentees. 20 years later, near Vasa, a crowd of refugees is stuck in a traffic jam. The 60 million square kilometer landmass of the Katla Isula just lost 6% of its total area. The illuminated sign on the motorway announces, "All lanes for entry." The red river of taillights shines in the autumn night, and somewhere in the middle of the giant traffic jam sits the machine in which Therese Machajek has been asleep for a long time now. Steam rises from under its hood. Mud-spattered radials arc over its sides. The nickel gills of the motor elements shine under the black plates that make up the motor carriage body. Inayat Khan is also curled up in the cabin, though he's not sleeping yet. He savors every passing moment, despite being, and precisely because he is, dead tired. The leather of the seat creaks under him, and through his blissful half-sleep, he can hear the newsroom airships outside. The propellers whir at a safe distance. The dark vortex of sleep beckons and swirls. Khan goes in and out of it as he pleases. Sometimes the machine jerks and moves a few meters. Then the disapparatist opens his eyes and sees Kenny walking by. The mad Surrey's rally ace chats with the other drivers and scrapes frost off his windshield. The present moment is one that Khan knows about. He will pine for it. He already misses the diamonds of the headlights, the blood-red glow of the taillights and the exhaust smoke. The knowledge that everything will be all right. It was 20 years ago when he last felt this way, full of possibilities. Back when they were waiting together for the girls to return from Grad. Out in the world, behind his closed eyelids, the kingdom of God begins. He presses his hands to his chest and embraces his invisible companion. All those spaces, the expanses there in the fallow fields and beside the highways, are opportunities for gatherings. As usual, conversations unfold in the darkness of Khan's thought cabinet. Malin Lund walks there beside him, nods and listens and asks questions. She laughs at his jokes, like she has for 20 years. They sit down on the side of the expressway. He doesn't mind. The girl's body has remained untouched by time. She still looks like a child, but her spirit has moved on with Khan. Fully grown, all grown up. She has weight to her now, mysterious and sad. 2 months passed, but the meeting at the end of August never happened. Although the girls returned to Vasa on the 15th of August, they didn't call. Why it was like that, and why they went to the Charlottesville beach 3 times during that period, remains a mystery. Through the blinds, the afternoon sun painted stripes on the walls. In the living room of Therese's father's cottage, the air stood still. Something rose up and made it hard to breathe. A vacuum. It was a sense of loss, a terrible, terrible worry. After several weeks of waiting by the phone in vain, they finally decided to call the girls themselves. The 3 of them stood in the living room. Therese hung up the phone. Beside him, Khan was impatient. "What happened? They weren't at home, were they?" Their mother picked up. Therese sinks into the armchair, baffled. "She said they were at the beach." "Which beach?" "In Charlottesville." "What? Why haven't they called then?" "I don't know. Something is wrong." And then the argument happened, the one over which Therese attacked Jesper 2 days later. He had immediately wanted to run down to the beach, and Khan was already tying his sneaker laces. Only Jesper still thought that it wasn't cool to do that. He thought they should wait and let the girls call them. So that's how they stayed. And 15 minutes later, at 1 o'clock, Agnetha, the server at the ice cream shop, was the last living person to see the Lund children. It It was the 28th day of August, the International Day of Missing Persons. From that day on, things had never been cool again. He tries not to use the word. It sounds like an accusation. Frozen and gasping for air, the interior designer falls on his back onto the sand. Hypothermia. It smells like rotting reeds. Rushes and fumitories stick to the ground in the gusting wind. He's 34 years old. He stomps on the wet sand with his heels. He doesn't know how or why he managed it. When his joints were cramping from the cold, why didn't he just roll off the board and into the sea? Why didn't he just stay inside the wave when it collapsed? In the dark autumn evening sky above, masses of clouds slowly sink into each other. He grabs his head with both hands and squeezes. His mouth, blue from the cold, opens slowly as gasps escape from his respiratory tract and his stomach undulates with contractions. He clenches his fists and digs his heels into the sand, but nothing changes. He remembers everything. The 52nd year still stands inside his skull. A strange, impossible museum exhibit, a replica of the lost world. The smell is ever sweeter, and always the same, an irrefutable fact, the weight of which cannot be overstated. There is no going back. In his dream, he can hear the sound of horses galloping. They're coming on the black asphalt of the motorway. Jesper. Con wants to call him and tell him to get ready. This is the real deal now. But there is no telephone booth here. It's dark in the kingdom of God, and mounted policemen are combing the lines between the machines. The silhouette of a nightmare stops on the other side of the window pane. Con opens his eyes. Steam rises from the horse's nostrils, and it snorts, its moist black eyes glinting at the half-asleep Con. An officer on horseback directs a beam of light through the frosty glass into the cabin, and then moves along. Horseshoes echo on the asphalt, and the horse moves away. Con closes his eyes and falls asleep again. His arms wrap into an embrace around his chest. When they had finally fallen asleep, Con had heard a terrible voice in his dreams. It was on the night of that same day, the 28th of August, and with that voice, horror descended upon the earth. At first he heard it in his sleep. Now it moved closer and closer, and called out, at regular intervals, Madge, Annie, Malin, Charlotte. The boy woke up in the bedroom on the second floor. He looked into Therese's fear-dilated eyes as his friend stood over him and shook him. Con was wide awake now, but the world's most dreaded list of absentees was still being read out outside in Charlotte's Hall. Not in his dream, but in the real world. The blood froze in Con's veins. "Do you hear that too?" "Yeah," answered Therese. They woke Jesper up. They all pulled their jackets on over their pajamas and ran outside. It was cold, and for the first time this year, there was a smell of autumn in the air. They stopped in the garden and listened. The names echoed in the forest along with the barking of dogs. They ran through the apple orchard, past the gooseberry bushes, into the darkness of the pine forest. Lights from flashlights and spotlights flashed among the trees. Search parties. At the end of the fourth day, the volunteers were sent home. Hundreds of them had come. Everyone wanted to help in some way, to take part in the worry. Thousands of calls came into a special hotline. Call to actions were made. Programs were run. The press and radio were getting bold, and the next morning the girls' pictures were right on the front cover. The headlines used the most disgusting sentimentality. Mother in despair. Children, please come home. Opinion columns discussed the possibility of reinstating the death penalty, and tearjerkers were mixed with a paranoid thirst for revenge. Who stole the children from their mother? This tumult of sympathy, in which the boy's own loss was completely lost. All this howling and gnashing of teeth. They felt powerless in the midst of it. It degraded them. At the time it was just a hunch, But now Jesper can put his indignation into words. Backseat curiosity. Somewhere beneath his fuming, the obscene bourgeois saw with his own sweet sense of horror all the things that were done to the girls. Through the newspaper article, he was able to peek behind the blackout curtain, where Père Jonas did not dare to look directly. He saw himself there. He was the man. He gnawed on a meat pierogi, and he liked what he saw. But when the preteen Jesper looked at the girls from his class, it was an indescribable mystery, an alien kingdom of bodies. The arch of the back, the exposed arm, the slightest part was enough. To this day, he hates adult sexuality. To him, it's exhaustingly demanding. Realistically, and in a paradoxical way, this makes him a pedophile. The receptionist in the lobby of Hafsanglar hangs up the phone just as the standard of good taste walks in his full-body wetsuit. It's the middle of the night, and he's dripping wet, leaving sandy footprints on the carpet. The gentleman looks so miserable, frozen half to death, that the woman forgets her telephone call and rushes to wrap him in a sauna towel. "No, I don't need an ambulance," Jesper says through chattering teeth, waving them off. "I don't want tea, I don't want it. I don't want blackcurrant tea either." He calls the elevator, and even after it's already lit up, he keeps pushing the button with his numb, frozen fingers. "No, I don't want to. I'm going to take a bath, a hot bath." "Mr. de la Garde," the woman remembers at the last moment. She puts the toe of her shoe between the closing elevator doors. "You got a phone call from an Ollie?" "During the night? About what?" "The newspaper ad?" The volunteers were sent home, and after the search parties, all the others left as well. The pine forests went quiet, as they usually were in the autumn. The boys limped through them. Bloodhounds no longer barked, border guard ships no longer roamed the bay, and wherever they went, it was as if the spirit of the void itself had been unleashed. Everything hung still and useless. Changing cabins, a sparse, half-empty beach. At the tram stop, the trams went back and forth empty, then half empty, the doors creaking open and closed. The last to go were the ill-fated divers. 3 weeks later. And so, the boys saw the long surrender begin all around. What that meant, they knew very well, although they never dared to say the word to each other. Together, they came up with the most fantastic plans, exhilarating triumphs, returning together. The school year had already officially begun over a month ago, and the joint decision of worried parents sent them back to school. There, photos of the girls, flowers, and storm lanterns awaited them on the stairs. The fake grief drifted through the corridors as well. Everyone had somehow known them. Everyone was fighting for attention and comparing their losses. The boys disappeared there, too. They didn't dare tell anyone what had happened in the summer. Finally, they poured out their hearts to the female officer when she visited their school, and as a result, Sigismund Berg, a boy who by that time was already a known figure among the youth police, was interrogated, along with 200 others. This treachery didn't bear any fruit, and when the female officer came to talk to the principal at the end of November, the three of them broke out of the classroom. The corridor echoed with the sound of their indoor shoes. She was their only connection to the investigation, that heartless entity. They stopped her at the door and pressed her for information until the poor woman had no other options left. "We have to get used to the idea that the girls are dead," she said. The pictures and storm lanterns were collected from the school stairs. The death penalty was not reintroduced. Even Vidkun Heerd was only given a life sentence. A year after his disappearance, he was arrested on suspicion of crimes with a similar profile, and the press rushed to link it all to Lund's children. The old maestro himself also dropped some relevant hints about the cubs that wandered too far from the mother bear, and other such Heerdisms. When the three of them got together, it was all they could talk about. This, or one other topic, which was fed to the boys by the volatile media interest. If not Heerd, or the recently released sex offender registry than the letter that was sent to Carl and Anne Margaret Lund 2 years after the girl's disappearance, the details of the handwriting analysis thereof, or, for example, the clairvoyant who claimed that the girls' bodies were buried under the foundations of the Ring Hall Ice Hockey Stadium. As the articles became rarer, the meetings became so hopeless that each of the boys tried to avoid them in his own way. Jasper secretly went to surf training and played sports. In year 10, Con was held back for the first time, and then dropped out of school. At the beginning of year 11, Therese went back to Grad. It was only 15 years later that the press finally lost interest in the Lund girls. The investigation had already ended a long time ago. The leading inspectors had all retired. There was no reason to get together anymore, so they retreated to their personal lives. Jasper found himself an underage lingerie model and pretended not to know Con when he saw him wearing a light blue cravat at a restaurant table. Therese went alone to Charlottesville every year. He wouldn't call the others. And Con plunged into the bluish-gray world of disappearances once and for all, sitting and clicking on the lights of an airship that went missing a century and a half ago in his mother's basement. Often. You yourself get used to this pointless fucking idea. At the end of the world, at the entrance to the city, the dark arches of the flag stops rise. The crossing gates are going up. The vests of the customs officials and the stripes on the barriers glow lemon yellow. The motor carriage takes off, and everything moves evenly, smoothly. In the leather-seat-scented din of radio airwaves, there is talk of a nuclear weapon that was dropped on Rivishol 3 hours ago. Con is warm. The female broadcaster's voice is even and beautiful. Rows of streetlights rise above the road, wreathed in cold halos, and slide under the dark blue morning sky. He drifts along with them, in his hometown, which he will leave behind tomorrow night. There's still one thing left to be done. The lanterns dim. Con watches, and the ghosts of the buildings come out in the white sky of the madrugada. The bedroom smells like lilies. Outside the window of the country house, everything is tinted blue, and the bony fingers of chestnut tree branches sway gently. She wakes up early in the morning and leaves her husband in bed, asleep beneath his sleep mask. The woman is 52 years old. Her face has fine features, and the smile lines around her eyes have sunk into crow's feet. Her dark green eyes are impassive beneath her lids. She goes downstairs, past the wooden handrail, in her dressing gown, and makes herself a coffee. The lights are off throughout the cool rooms of the wooden house and in its spacious kitchen. She likes these blue hours when the house is quiet, when she can hear the field mice scratching under the floorboards. A delicate hand with sharp fingers pushes down the piston of the coffee press. Even the smell of mould that rises from the floorboards has grown on her over time, although she was so petrified by it at first, 17 years ago when she moved out here. And the silence. Everything is so quiet in the countryside. But over time, even that absence had become a kind of blessing. She goes across the living room, over the cold floorboards. In the dim light, the furniture shines all around her. The elegance of the 50s, paint peeling off the wood. At the door, she pulls her husband's coat over her shoulders and steps into his shoes. Just like that, with her gray hair put up in one simple motion, she steps out onto the porch. The autumn cold makes the coffee cup in her hand emanate thick steam. She stops for a moment, breathes, and then takes a seat on the wooden garden furniture of her choice. Then, leg over knee, Anne Margaret Lund smokes her first cigarette of the day. She watches the light, the sun rising behind the morning mist. In the well-kept garden in front of her, details emerge from the fog. The glass of the greenhouse shines. The grass needs raking. This will be her first chore of the day. She puts out the smoke in an upside-down flower pot serving as an ashtray and goes back inside. Children of beautiful parents are beautiful. Children of ugly parents are ugly. Anne Margaret moisturizes her still beautiful body in the downstairs shower. It wasn't always like this. At first, she was as stick-thin as a scarecrow. She was still a little girl then, climbing over planks and up trees with the boys. Then the woman's hormones kicked in and wove a new alien body around her. An object of admiration made up of fatty tissues and curves. In time, she learned to master its subtleties, graduated from university, taught, fell in love, brought 3 daughters into the world, 3 years in a row, 1 every year. They were left behind from her like pearls from a necklace, and her body restored itself, young as she was. It made her friends jealous, how she slept in her husband's arms without shame. But later, when she joined her political party, another one came, the youngest one. Her husband loved her, and so he wasn't horrified when the last one permanently disfigured her. Though the Earth's force of gravity prevailed in its own realm, her mind rose high, in the ministry, in her career. But now, Anne Margaret Lund stands in front of the mirror, and although her skin has lost its elasticity and some of its radiant color, her hips are narrow again, and her thighs are slim. Everything has contracted again. But this time, she feels a faintness about her body instead of relief. It doesn't matter that the feeling of absence, silence, peace, and the smell of mould in her new shelter had entered her, secretly made her its own. She is a void. But when she looks at herself, Anne Margaret still gets scared, as if all of that being a woman had somehow never happened. She tries not to think about it too hard. She dries herself quickly, covers herself in beige day clothes, and leaves. The woman rakes dry leaves in the garden. Back then, when she went to the school at the end of the first semester, the boys had secretly watched. It was the first semester without them, and Anne Margaret went to empty her daughter's closets. A crowd of respect surrounded her. The children moved away. Only Therese, Jesper, and little Inayet watched from around the corner as the woman put her daughter's trinkets from the last year into cardboard boxes. She rolled up a poster of a pop star, and gold stars dropped from between her fingers. None of the boys told each other why they came there to spy, but secretly they wanted to get pats from her, go home with her, look at the girls' rooms, and then make plans to find them. It was a childish longing. They wanted to be important to what was happening, and if anyone had the power to bless them with that role, it was the girl's beautiful mother. That didn't happen, but later they all came anyway, separately, although they kept it a secret from each other. They found out the location of her countryside home and awkwardly expressed their sympathy to the woman. They also exchanged news in relation to the investigation, and finally, at last, Anne Margaret remembered all of their names, although the last time this happened was 8 years ago. Later, when Therese and Con confessed, Jesper still lied that he hadn't done such a thing. Pretty sad stuff, he had said sarcastically. Anne Margaret steps out from between the bare gooseberry bushes, hangs her gardening gloves on a nail in the shed, and sends her husband to work. Carl Lund still toils hard like a passionate industrial magnate, although political instability and the resulting international economic crisis are destroying his venture. It doesn't matter that he actually has enough money to go anywhere, even to Stella Maris to retire. The chauffeur comes to pick him up at 10:30, and his luxury car is wrapped in the grey fog of the village road. Anne Margaret watches him leave from the garden as the crimson of the taillights fades into the distance. Besides her husband and her morning ritual of fear, all signs that she had once had 4 blonde, green-eyed daughters fade away. One had dark blonde hair, and another had rainbow-colored eyes. But when she puts on the music to play softly and moves her shoulders to the beat, she can no longer remember whose features those were. Then when the guilt subsides and daylight comes in between the white lace curtains, Anne Margaret Lund feels light. She floats, as if her whole life had not been lived, and all the impressions, the small dents that a person leaves in the world, would be hammered out in the rhythm of the music. She moves modestly in the shadow of her family tree, from which all the leaves have fallen. She doesn't know anymore that the way she puts her upper lip on top of her lower lip, forgetting herself and humming along to the music, is exactly how Charlotte did it. She sweeps the floors, straightens the tablecloths, and taps the rows of books on the shelves to make them even. She doesn't listen to the radio. It means nothing to her. As far as Anne Margaret is concerned, the world ended a long time ago and left her here to do housework. She sits at the kitchen table with her hands folded and watches how the household shines. It's 4:30. The rooms are quiet and clean. Sometimes she naps like a cat in the afternoon, her grey head bobbing above the table. It had happened overnight, like it did for Dolores Day. 20 years ago, on the morning of the 29th of August, she woke up, and her hair had turned grey. She hears music in her sleep. Light from the kitchen window floods her hair, and for a moment it looks golden again. The door knocker raps on the door like a woodpecker. Maybe Coral left something, or he's coming home early. But why knock? It just seems unlikely that anyone would visit her. Almost no one comes here anymore, and she likes it that way. Anne Margaret Lund adjusts her clothes, straightens her over-the-knee skirt that got wrinkled while she was sitting, readies her mouth for a smile, and opens the door. "Hello, madam." 3 men stand there, with awkward smiles on their faces. One is wearing terribly expensive clothing and smells of 500 real aftershave, unable to hide the fever that's making his forehead glow red. The second one is standing next to him in a dark orange windbreaker, with a scarf in the tricolor of Ilmara around his neck. And the third, tall and lanky, hurries to extinguish a smoke. Although recognition is slow to come, she invites the men in and watches them stand there in their outside clothing. It's only when she sees the boyish timidity with which they shuffle from foot to foot and scuff the floor with their toes that she remembers who they are. This reminds her of the behavior of a young admirer. "We have news," says Inayat Khan. "I know, yes. You shouldn't get your hopes up. But this is good news, madam." When the lady leads them into the kitchen, her heart feels as heavy as lead again, and her hair is silver in the dim half-light. Coffee. Tea. 5 hours ago, Jesper sits in the Café Kino, in the midday light, between the glass walls and cubicle furniture. He feels a little less projected than usual. His head is thick, and his eyelids are strangely heavy. He wipes a trickling bead of sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. The interior designer looks more miserable than usual. He pulls his sweater off over his head. In his dress shirt, he starts to cool down again. The late autumn cold seeps through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A crowd passes by outside. He orders himself 1 green tea with lemon and honey. "I must have caught a little cold," he says across the table to a man a few years younger than himself. He does remember him. It's little Ollie. He was 4 grades below them. Jesper mainly remembers Ollie's brilliant talent for forgery. The upperclassman had used his golden hand for all kinds of signatures, and the boy made good money that way. All these report cards full of failing grades and planners full of misdemeanor notes that needed signatures. Now little Ollie has grown a big brown mustache, and Jesper draws his own conclusions from this. Ollie is a copywriter, and mustaches are in fashion again, in certain circles. In circles where the innocence of nihilism, San Miro, is seen as some kind of exotic poet. At least, that was the case up until 2 days ago, when the country from which both San Miro and the old-fashioned mustache craze originated hadn't yet used an atomic weapon on another country. That their nihilism trend seems to be kicking the bucket now, Jesper mentions passingly. Ollie agrees enthusiastically. "Yeah, I should get rid of the mustache, I know. The news was a bombshell to all of us. Pardon the expression. Do we perhaps? Yeah, it's terrible. Jesper interrupts him mid-sentence. A total tragedy. Why did you call me, Ollie? I read this advertisement and I thought about it for a long time. Only when the bomb went off did I, finally feel sorry about it, I guess. What the hell, Ollie? What's going on? What did you feel sorry for? The mustachioed copywriter starts. Jesper has suddenly turned beet red in front of him. He leans closer across the table. As Ollie tries to hide his eyes, his focus is pulled away from Jesper by the albino tiger in the far corner of the cafe. Although the copywriter often comes here to make acquaintances, he's never liked that creepy stuffed animal. Wait a sec, I didn't snuff them out. I just wrote those letters. Why in God's name would you do something like that? I don't know, stammers Ollie. I was young then. I really don't know why I did it. Everyone at school was talking about them after it happened. Maybe I just wanted to see what would happen. Like, will they figure out that it wasn't really Malin? This guy, this Ziggy, brought me Malin's old notebook and asked if I could handle the handwriting. It seemed pretty easy, and, well, I thought I'd give it a try. And you sent them? Or did someone else? Ziggy sent them. I just wrote them. I'm really sorry about that. You have to understand that I was young then, and, well, I considered myself a little bit of a nihilist, too. And you have nothing else to say about it. You don't know anything about them. Even if, for example, I went to the police with this story, you wouldn't have any more to say. Unfortunately, yes. It seems that Ollie is sorry from the bottom of his heart. He smooths his mustache nervously, and Jesper looks out the window to Osterbaum. His eyes glassy from fever. A crowd in dark clothes pushes past the window. His mouth reddens. He pulls his sweater back on and grabs his coat from the rack. Idiot, he says, and leaves. Ollie stays behind to pay the bill. When the check is brought to the table, the albino tiger is still glaring at him viciously. And that's good news, Anne Margaret asks, and ashes her cigarette 6 hours later. Puffs of smoke rise from her and Therese Matchijek's mouths. A uniform. Thin, gray light seeps from the sky. She sits with the 3 men around a wooden table on the porch outside, and a gust of wind blows dark brown leaves across the floor. Jesper, having finished his story, feels wrong-footed. But then Con jumps in. No, that's not all. Look at it this way. What's remarkable about this is that 20 years later, with the way the world is now, new things are still coming to light. Meaning there's still time, and I have a feeling that that's why everything is coming out right now, because there's something in the air. The former minister sits with her back stick straight, her leg folded femininely over her knee. She is expectantly silent, and it cools Con's enthusiasm. The man takes a sip of what's left of his coffee. Or rather, he pretends to take one. There's nothing there but a thick layer of sugar. Con starts up again. Now, I don't know what you might be thinking about it, or how seriously you're taking it. For example, I don't take it very seriously, Jesper interjects. Anyway, Con continues, a little annoyed. I'll tell you right away that I do. Take it seriously, I mean. We just came from Lemon K's, by the way, from a meeting with a private consultant. He's quite well known, although he keeps a low profile. Therese gives him a warning look, and Con changes tack. Ulv is his name. Have you heard of him? I don't think I have. You go to him with things that you can't get information about anywhere else, with things that are stuck. He's been involved in the investigation of at least 12 deaths, and he's always helped somehow. In general, the police don't brag about it, but Therese can assure you that it's true. Former Agent Matchijek nods his head. He feels the woman's eyes on him, and tries to behave as one would behave at work, with one of their own. Tries to be frigidly respectful, reliable. But he doesn't feel like he manages it. We love the girls. We love them more. He's so embarrassed about his earlier thoughts. At first he tries not to look back at her, but then he lifts his eyes. For a moment, his hazel eyes meet Anne Margaret's tired emeralds. His methods are such that they're not noted later in the official investigation. Therese begins. It's a silent agreement with the prosecutor's office. Mentioning it would give the defense too much to latch onto. This is some kind of paradetective, I've come to understand. Under the pressure of the media, the police and the city government have finally dug up the entire west wing of Ringhall. The clairvoyant had rolled his eyes and kept pointing, but the only thing that came out of the concrete foundation was more concrete foundation, and that was just one specific case. There have been more than enough necromancers. The woman allows herself some bitterness. Therese signals Con to wait. When I do my job, I don't do it for the rule of law. I'm doing it for the sake of the victim. When he talks like this, he forgets himself. His confidence returns. He's a collaboration police agent again, not the leaf in the wind that he's made himself out to be. So I don't care how or from what we get the information, as long as it gets results. It's true. I haven't been to this particular private advisor. Unfortunately, his field only deals with cases where the victim is already dead. But he's got an undeniable talent for this. For example, this same Ulf has himself also been a suspect in 8 different cases that he's advised on. If that sounds authoritative to you, it honestly does to me. They were totally unrelated incidents, and no evidence has ever been found against him. Do you understand? She pulls out a smoke thoughtfully, and when Therese offers her a light, Con takes the opportunity. He laughs across the table and blurts out, "He doesn't know anything about the girls." And what does that mean? The woman is at a loss. Con looks at her with a broad smile. He can't give any information about them. Nothing. A completely blank page. He doesn't know where they are. He doesn't know anything about their past. No secrets, but that's the point. He knows nothing because they aren't dead. The woman is secretly horrified. Her ladylike posture remains unchanged. Therese notices something suspicious in her reaction, but out of great respect, he can't say what it is yet. And that same consultant says that? And Margaret keeps looking at them questioningly. Con places a stack of paper in front of her. These are my notes about the girls. This is the summary I gave him. His notes are there at the end. You'll see that those are the exact words he uses. Not dead. And Margaret flips through the pages. The world-shaking calamity slips by again under her gaze. Photocopies and dates, a chronology of events. In such a case, it is customary to give a proofing envelope as well. Con continues, if it's not possible to verify the correctness of the first, currently the girls, we would have nothing to prove with it by itself. Then the correctness of the second proves it. And guess who else isn't dead yet? Con pulls out his second envelope from his jacket pocket and places it on the table. It wasn't until Therese finally saw this that he began to seriously consider Con's strange experiment. Sigismund Berg is written on it. Jesper doesn't know anything about it yet. He watches, neck craned out of curiosity. I gave him Ziggy. Con is in the zone. He forgets himself and talks directly to Jesper. The arcs of connection he draws in the air become more and more fantastical. How one para-specialist's statement proves the other. A yarn ball of dotted lines, the label proudly stating Axiom. And then these letters, too. How they absolutely have to find out what became of that shaggy-headed kid in the leather jacket. The arrow jumps. What else can come out of it? Only Therese, who's already heard all of this, is still observing Anne Margaret's reaction. There is none. The woman just stares at one page in the girl's folder. It's slowly getting dark outside, and cold. She's raised her coat collar, and when Therese catches her eye, she doesn't answer. She hasn't really been reading for a long time. She just stares, the familiar dark green of her eyes standing still. What is that feeling? Just barely slipping along deep down in there. Therese thinks he knows, how the corners of her eyes are slightly lowered. This unrecognizability. She is recalling. But what? The evening is drawing in a blue twilight, and Con, in the middle, burns like a bulb. All around, in the quiet rural village, the air is crystal cold. The man leans back into his folding chair and wipes his glasses with a triumphant expression. Beside him, Therese decides on the easiest solution and reaches out to grab the edge of the folder. The woman is still holding it. She hasn't managed to turn the page yet. "May I?" "Yes, of course." And Margaret nods. It's as if she wakes up. "It's all very confusing, I have to admit." And while Con explains how the children's mother should now contact the police about it, Therese looks at the 4 photos of Lund's children from the folder. Con has lined them up by age, like pearls in a necklace. And Margaret closes the garden gate after the visitors leave. She waves gently through the back window. The taxi rolls down the gravel road. It's no longer Kenny at the wheel. Kenny has long since gone to his Kenny world to do Kenny things. They are 40 kilometers from Vasa, and they can't get away from that white country house in the midst of the chestnut trees fast enough. They are all secretly relieved to leave. It's also kind of embarrassing, and no one can say a thing as the gravel crunches under the wheels. In the end, Con still tries. She, didn't seem too happy, or something. Jesper snorts. You just had to have this moronic idea. Well, in your view, what do you think we should have done? Not talk to her at all? Let her figure out herself what was up with those letters, for example? Yes. They're not dead, Mrs. Lund. Your children are alive children. You just couldn't let her be, could you? The mystery had to be solved. For a little while longer they sit quietly and stare out the window. Village roads pass. The car rattles, and Therese asks the driver if he can smoke inside. He lights up. The match flashes in the dim interior, and the cigarette paper crackles in its flame. The bitter Astra smoke circulates around the cabin. After so long in Kenny's machine, it feels kind of treacherous to be sitting here. Con's conscience begins to sting. Maybe we really shouldn't have done it. What if she's resigned herself to it, and we annoyed her like that for no reason? What if nothing will come out of this? You think? Jesper retorts snidely. Maybe it was our duty to rush into a stranger's home and tell her about her children. He's lost in thought for a moment before starting up again. I honestly don't believe it, Con. That she's resigned or whatever. Maybe she's just trying to move on with her life. Of course, I'm not a parent. Therese pulls out an ashtray from the door. He smokes in silence. They avoid the network of motorways and the traffic jams there, driving along the village roads between fields and groves in the evening. Halfway through their drive, he's on his 6th smoke, and the cabin is slowly getting stuffy. The ex-agent politely rolls down the window, and fresh air rushes in, along with a few snowflakes. They float outside on the edge of the ditch. Bare bushes rush past them, and snow is starting to fall in the distance, over the fields. She hasn't resigned herself to it, says Therese. She's forgotten. I didn't see any pictures of them in that whole house. She also looked at them in this folder of yours as if she was trying to remember who they were. Con shivers from the cold. Nobody says anything. That means they agree. There's another long pause before Jesper shivers too. This is how they let each other know how it makes them feel. They rarely talk among themselves about what they really think, about all of that vanishing. It's like this because they talked too much at first. So much so that talking no longer helped. Everything has been said, and they have nothing left to comfort each other with. That's why it's so surprising when Jesper says, "Sometimes it seems to me that the whole world has forgotten them." And that's how it is, says Therese. And Con says, "Let's go find this cocksucker's house." "Let's get it done today already," says Therese. Hearing this, Con asks, "Where do we want to go?" "To Grad," Therese replies, and they both look in Jesper's direction. "Davai," says Jesper. With the darkness comes a blizzard. They drive through the streets of Salem, and the city around them closes down in the storm, for the first time this year. The sweet, cold smell of snow wafts into the cabin, with Con when he comes back with a large suitcase in each hand. He leaves tracks behind in the snow. His old mother stands at the door with her apron on and calls out about something, but no one hears what it is. And the machine is already speeding down the road, and snow swirls outside in the street tunnel. It snows the whole time they're waiting for Jesper in front of his house. 2 hours. It already seems like they might not reach their night train. The wind blows white ribbons from the spruce trees. The black motor carriage is buried under snow. Finally, Jesper comes out with a white suitcase in his hand. How did it go? Well, let's just say it didn't go too well, he replies. Let's ride. They drive. Fast. They ask the taxi driver to drive even faster, but that would be too dangerous. The blizzard paints streaks in the headlights. Its chaos scatters everywhere. On the roads, in the orange halos of the streetlights. Therese throws money to the driver and gets out first, glancing at his watch. He runs across the snowy square, the sound of the taxi doors slamming shut left behind him. He doesn't care that Jesper left his things behind at his place. Jesper's only regret is that he couldn't find the scrunchie when he left the lingerie model. He really could have been harsher. He feels bad about that, too. He runs with his suitcase in his hand, snow sticking in his eyes, and all kinds of backhanded witticisms come to mind. With this fashion stuff, you see, it's not good anymore. This model stuff, it has no future. You're taking my house, and you're going to live in Vasa now. It's not safe to travel. Do you get it? It's time to get a real job. It's nighttime, but even so, there's a crowd in front of the elevators. They curse as Therese flashes his false documents. Collaboration, please, move. He is no longer Somerset Ulrich. Now, he's Cosmo Konchalovsky. Cosmo is not a missing agent. He's Therese's own brainchild. To cover the tracks, no one can trace him. Only when a filled to the brim elevator car lifts them above the city do the three boys sit down on top of their suitcases and catch their breath. The city is buried in snow. There below, in the bows of the motorways, its light seeps into a saturnine green, into the gold of the streetlights, into orange, until the darkness of the floating train station engulfs them. The elevator doors open, and they run under the high steel arches of the station building. There, too, a nocturnal crowd awaits them. It's crowded everywhere, in the hall, in front of the ticket offices, even though the boards show that there are no free seats, and the kitten-like voice from the box speakers confirm it. Even the flight the day after tomorrow to Samara, SRV, is fully sold out. Exactly. A degenerate bureaucratic workers' republic is where you want to be right now. Not to mention that at this very moment in Grad, the honeycomb irrigation network is disappearing, after which a wave crest will rise menacingly over Yakokata. Where are you running to? Stay home. Join the army. They squeeze themselves out onto the platform. It's snowing high up under the night sky as well, and when the car attendant cuts them off in front of the 5-fold running boards of the magnet train, Therese does something he never does. Cosmo Konchalovsky's authoritative flashes no longer have any effect on the car attendant, numbed by the bustle of the crowd. The kitten-voiced girl announces the imminent departure of the flight and asks everyone to step behind the yellow line. They can already hear the hydraulics of the train doors hissing. Therese puts his hand under his jacket and pulls out a pistolet. The leather pocket of the holster hangs under his arm. Mahogany handle firmly in his palm, he passes through the doors into the luxurious gloom of the train. The barrel of the gun gleams, and the car attendant retreats before the service weapon. Behind, Con and Jesper also slip in. The doors slam shut behind them. The magnets hum. One of Con's suitcases is left behind on the platform. Therese puts the pistolet back in its holster and apologizes to the horrified attendant. They're not used to this kind of thing here in Katla. The ex-agent thanks the woman for her cooperation. He's back to using diplomacy. Outside on the platform, giant buffers are being pulled off the train. The umbilical cord is cut, and thus, freed from the connecting bridges, the entire weight of the train, with its 5-fold carriage slats, sinks onto the magnets. They howl at full power below the train cars, and then the flight begins. The magnetic support splits the North Sea under it in two. It's quiet inside, the generators humming as the train whizzes by 50 meters above the water. The three of them stand together, laughing. Therese extinguishes his smoke in a bronze ashtray, and they turn their back on the observation windows. Ahead, the Pale awaits, and past it begins a big world. Somewhere out there, in its cities, streets, or steppe expanses, is Sigismund Berg, the only person in the world who knows what happened to the Lund children. Through the windows, all that's left of the city behind them is the light pollution, a golden glow in the distant darkness of the snowstorm. "15. MOULD. Dirk Trentmuller lies in a catatonic state. The retirement home around him is silent. He no longer remembers the name of anything, and any connections are meaningless to him. Everything is forgettable. He looks at the whole world with a blissful question mark, like a child. After 2 months, the nurse comes to his room, and, stopping at the door, breathes a sigh of relief. They disconnect the cannula from the old man's wrist. A lace of tree branches slides along the walls of the ward, and outside in the suburbs, a motor carriage whizzes by. Its wheels crunch on the snow. Inside, in the warm cabin, sits the well-known minimalist and deaf music critic Ari Ackerlund, Jesper's colleague from his office days. His prospects don't look bright. It's almost impossible to plagiarize music record reviews from the West if no new records are being made. But Ari Ackerlund does a lot of cocaine, and that, as we know, makes one very intelligent. The social climate is different now, but consumption as such remains. This means that there's still room for advertising. Ari Ackerlund lays the foundation for the later world-famous Ideas Laboratory in Vasa, an advertising agency that produces ideas for advertisements instead of actual advertising. Someone else will actually create the ads later. In a few months, a masterpiece of apocalyptic advertising will be born from the Ideas Laboratory. The transport giant Zam's Interresolary campaign is also getting started in the Nordic countries with the slogan, "Escape, it's not too late." At that time, or a little later, around the winter solstice, Conrad Gessel's newly released documentary goes unnoticed by the general public. The winter will be long and dark, and the panicked masses demand lighter entertainment. It doesn't matter that the director is an 8-time Oscars or nominee. But then, the ecumenical aggressor of Mask brings their fleet out of the Pale, this maneuver sending them gliding across the far north of the Boreal Plateau. Beneath the northern lights, black smoke rises into the sky from the Holodnaya Zemlya Oblast of Grad. Arda, Vasa, and Surama then joined Grad, which had declared war on Mask 2 months earlier. And with that, Katla, this patch of land on the edge of the world, is dragged into the great centrifuge. The viewer numbers of the film Vidkun Hird start to improve. Much to his dismay, however, Conrad Gessel sees the kind of audience in cinema halls that he had feared the most when he started his controversial project. Bad times give discontent a national color. There sit the military youth, mesmerized, together with senile Nazi grandpas. None of them really understand the humanist Gessel's subtle treatment of symbols, his irony, his sense of the absurd. The dim-witted militarists sincerely admire Hird's black shirt posturing without the slightest irony. They're especially impressed by how the great figure finally collapses under his own superhuman maxims. They find it poetic how he blurts out unrelated talk in his final interviews. The chilling shots of a vegetating Hird in his cell move them to tears. In the end, it turns out that even he, with his mind of a mythical hero, couldn't survive on those ancient truths. They were too honest, too genuine. Warrior as he was, Hird persisted until the end, without sinking back down into the influence of a diluted cultural space. Therein lay his triumph, his hubris, and his downfall. The truth is simply too mighty. This is just one of several end-of-the-world absurdities, but Sven von Fersen, inspired by this, decides that it's time to come out of the closet. Over time, Sven phased out his witty management articles and replaced them with statements of support for the government and the armed forces. When Grad and its northern allies find themselves on the losing side of a world war, the only real opposition is organized in Ilmara. Sven von Fersen doesn't want a helping hand from the camel shits. Before you even notice, they'll stab you in the back with a scimitar. But in the end, fascism will remain on the fringes of society, where it has always been, between cryptozoology and psionics. The vast majority of people are not like Sven von Fersen. The Nordic sense of style is too clearly developed in them, and extremes can't find a voice. The editor's delicate hand eradicates racially insensitive vocabulary from such writings. He doesn't simply leave them unpublished. That would be against freedom of expression. In this way, this plot of land in the Pale enters the phase of geopolitical apocalypse alongside the rest of the world. But rather than collapsing, it drifts apart. Still a social democracy. They still generously give out paychecks to those who just loiter around. Cruiser ships are sunk by shellfire in the North Sea, but the state still offers the unemployed artist retraining opportunities in his own field. Grad loses the Boreal Plateau in the north. Jelenka burns in the 3-month winter night, and no one survives. But the unemployed Per Jonas is still talking about the book he's writing. Grad abandons the insignificant war theater of Katla in order to gather forces for the defense of its home Isla. The road to Arda is now open to the aggressor, and the front moves closer day by day. But there's still no news about Per Jonas's book. In this manner, despite the objections of the extremists, the nation of Vasa goes behind the curtains of history with its 3-year paid paternity leave and impeccably functioning public transport. Nothing seems to stop future ecologically oriented projects there either. In the very last months, when the Pale is creeping against the ocean towards Vasa, lobby groups against light pollution see their grand dream come true. Industrial and commercial buildings turn off artificial lighting at the end of the working day, and streetlights are shielded with special filters. As the first and last big city in the history of the world, Vasa completely eliminates light pollution. This isn't just a measure against bomb raids. It also saves birds who might otherwise get lost in the city's maze of lights, and harbor seals whose mating rhythms are disrupted when the day is too long. You may laugh at this, but in the evening, when the big world in the distance swells into a bloody maelstrom, families come out into the street in Vasa and are insignificant together. Only distant explosions disturb the deep peace of the winter night, its flawless, starry sky. Everyone watches, heads tilted back. Khan's old mother also watches, in Salem. Her eyes are painted beautifully in Ilmaran colors. A golden headscarf covers her hair. It's cold, and the woman's breath steams in the streets of the wooden city. Alia Khan had seen her son for the last time that night, 4 years ago. It wasn't much later, no more than a month, that he called and said goodbye to his mother. Families mill around, among them men of service age. Eniat had said that he wouldn't return, but they come from the northern front all the time, soldiers. Even the war has somehow been neglected. All of this is a kind of degeneration, a giving in. But even in this is a motto, precisely associated with moralism, a movement whose daughter cell is social democracy, reflected. It reads like this: For a moment, it seemed as if there was hope for humanity. Then, when the stars bend under the destruction falling from above, many can no longer take the phrase the end of the world entirely seriously. The panic has cooled. In the strange indifference of the evacuation, whole families stay behind in Vasa. There they play board games in their houses, in their spacious apartments. They love vitamin-rich food, and when the Pale is only a few days away, it's always signaled by the same beautiful event. fruits go moldy, it grows vigorously on them. Children listen to oranges crackling on the table. Spores sprout from the pulp. Apples are hairy with it. If you try to touch them, they crack open. No one knows why it's like that, but few can muster the energy to be afraid of that time, and that's why I say it's beautiful. Khan's mother is one of those who decide to stay behind in Vasa when the Pale comes. Many others flee. They head up to Orda, closer to the front and away from the Pale. There, in the winter's orbit, Anita Lundqvist and her delicate hands go to the munitions factory to polish cartridges. In these last few years, especially after the evacuation, the lingerie model seems extremely strong. All the frivolity and thirst for life that made the girl an exemplary human being in a functioning world translate into something completely different at the end of the world. These are leadership qualities, and Anita Lundqvist is the queen of the refugee camp. When Ari Ackerlund meets her there, he doesn't even recognize her. Who is this Valkyrie? But then Anita comes to him, greets him by name, and reveals medication in her apron to alleviate Ackerlund's withdrawal symptoms. The famous minimalist and deaf music critic is grateful. He tells the girl about an international drug business that no longer operates, and how the black currency HR, the intersolari real, has been devalued, and the world economy has collapsed. Finally, Ackerlund tells her about the non-world, everything he experienced on the way to the refugee camp. He came to Orda on foot. Left behind in the evacuation, he had pushed for 2 months across the frozen fjords. He came through abandoned ghost towns, alone with the Pale on his heels. He crawled across the permafrost, where the wreckage of downed airships was buried in the snowdrifts around him. Ackerlund also tells her about the horse that dragged his sleigh, and that he eventually ate. Anita reciprocates and tells him about Jesper. She says only good things. The factory where Anita works is a strategic resource. Although it's hidden deep in the fjords, the recently launched Mesk reconnaissance satellite Mosaic finds it there. The ecumenical aggressor wipes out the munitions factory with a hail of bombs, and the lingerie model is lost in the whirlwind of war. This is 6 years after the night of the blizzard, when Khan, Jesper, and Therese drove away. Below, above the southern coast of Katla, the enemy of matter, the great transition, buries the former Isola. Vasa and Charlottesville Beach were once there. Now no one leaves there, even though those who were left behind, friends and family members, are awaited in the camps. And Margaret Lund also sits there somewhere, in her kitchen, in the middle of the Pale. Her rooms are quiet and clean. The former teacher wears a beige jacket and an above-the-knee skirt, and watches the molding apricots. It would probably be too much to say that she hasn't called the police in the meantime. And Margaret lets go of her husband's hand. Like everyone else, she can't do anything in this extended stay, where one's sense of the present slowly drifts away. But whereas the others dissolve into their memories, she simply disappears. It's as if her life had never happened. The past is not awaiting her return. She just wanders around the rooms, adjusts her grandmother's lace doily and bedspreads, arranges the curtains on the rail, and thus, tastefully, she refuses to indulge in those ecstasies which visit the human spirit when the world is disintegrating. Nothing leaves her hands, and nothing returns. When Katla finally sinks into the Pale, Anne Margaret Lund turns, without the slightest pleasure, into a protein mass.